We are joined by Erik Solheim, the former diplomat and a participant in the Norwegian delegation as the third party to the Sri Lankan peace process, who mediated peace talks between the Sri Lankan government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. This peace process lasted almost 5 years, following a ceasefire agreement that was reached in the early 2002. Norway was unsuccessful in its attempt to resolve the Sri Lankan civil war. Joining us as well is Mark Salters. He is the author of the book To End a Civil War, Norway's Peace Engagement in Sri Lanka. Thank you to both for joining us. Mr. Solheim, let me start off with you. Norway was unsuccessful, as I have mentioned in the introduction, in its attempt to resolve the civil war in Sri Lanka. At this moment, does Norway have any involvement in Sri Lanka?
Neither Norway nor myself as an individual have any formal involvement in Sri Lanka at the moment. But of course we know all the main characters there. We know for sure all the key leaders of the government and the state, like the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, and we have deep contacts with the Tamil diaspora and with the Tamil community. So we try to be helpful in any way where we can help, to provide understanding between the communities, to encourage investment, encourage the Tamil diaspora to go back and invest and work in Sri Lanka. So we try to be as helpful as we can, but there is absolutely no formal Norwegian role in Sri Lanka at the moment.
Mr. Mark Salters, is this book an effort to bring Norway's story in regards to Sri Lanka's peace process? How did this project start and how long of a project was this?
Well, I mean, the process of putting the book together from start to finish was, at least to when I finished writing, was about 2 years. But actually, even the process of generating the structure and the outline of the book took some work between myself and Erik and his colleague Vidar Helgesen, former Deputy Foreign Minister, because it was about thinking about who would it be useful to talk to. Who would it be useful to talk to in Sri Lanka, in Norway, and amongst some of the other international actors who were involved in the peace process. India, for example, the US, the EU, the UN, and so on. And then, of course, having identified who to talk to, there was the little matter of actually getting out there to talk to them. By and large, that worked very well. In India, we had a few issues in some areas of the Foreign Ministry of getting access to people, but in the US, great access to State Department people, ditto in Norway, of course. And really, the only my two sadnesses in terms of who I got to talk to, one of them was unavoidable, which was amongst the leadership of the LTTE, because of course most of them are now dead, sadly. So there was nobody in the leadership from that period who I could speak to. And the other side was on the Sri Lankan, on the government side. Under Mahinda Rajapaksa's government, there was a tremendous reluctance to talk about the peace process and everything that happened before. So I really found it hard to get people from the government to talk to me.
Would it be wrong to assume that the book is not complete without the input of the LTT's leadership? And do you think that the book will be criticized for that same factor?
Well, it's not true to say that the LTT's views are not there. I mean, for example, I talked to Rudra Kumaran, who, as you probably know, was part of the LTT delegation to a number of the peace talks. And I talked to a number of other individuals, both in London and elsewhere, who were connected to the LTT leadership. But who I didn't get to talk to was everybody from Prabhakar and downwards, Tamil Shelva and so on, because they were dead. Now, you could, if you want, criticise me for that, but there's not a lot I could do about it. So I just register it as a sad silence in the book.
To end a civil war, Norway's peace engagement in Sri Lanka play any role in Sri Lankan's Tamil quest for peace and recognition in the long run?
Well, obviously I would hope so, although I'd want to be modest. It's a book, it's not a peace process laid out before you. How I think it can help is that, number one, it can provide a simple sort of storyline of what happened beforehand. Know what happened before you try and do something new. The other thing we have at the end of the book, there's a whole section devoted to lessons learned from the Norwegian involvement in Sri Lanka, and I think there's a number of issues that are identified there which would actually be critical for any future efforts to promote reconciliation and a political resolution to the conflict in Sri Lanka. So I hope, at least in a modest way, it will provide a resource for those who seek to develop peace in Sri Lanka.
Mr. Solheim, do you think Norway has a role to play in Sri Lanka at this moment?
I don't think there is a front seat role for Norway in Sri Lanka at the moment, but I think there is a big role for Norway to play from the back seat, which is to support all peace efforts, to share our experience, to promote investment in critical sectors like maybe fisheries, maybe solar energy and other areas, to encourage Tamil diaspora to go back, to invest, to work with the present government. I think there is a lot Norway can do, but no one should expect that Norway will have a front role as we did have at the peak of the peace process.
You're well aware we cannot talk about Sri Lanka without talking about what happened in 2009. Was Norway or yourself in any way involved in trying to stop the final war?
Absolutely, we were working very, very hard to try to find a solution which could save the lives of all the Tamil civilians who were trapped in the war zone, as well as the LTT cadres who were there, because we knew at this time that the government would pursue a full military victory, and there was no way we could stop that. We could speak to the international community and ask them to try to play a moderating role, but we knew the outcome of the war. So our appeal to Mr. Prabhakaran was to let us find an organized end to this war, where all the Tamil civilians will be saved and the LTT cadres will be registered, but they will get an amnesty. Unfortunately, Mr. Prabhakaran was not amendable to this offer, which we made both directly through telephone to the LTT leadership, but also through KP. Who was then the kind of the foreign representative of the LTT appointed by Prabhakaran himself.
Did the leader of the LTTE, Velupillai Prabhakaran, reject such an offer from Norway to stop the war?
Very clearly he did. We were not able to speak directly to him, obviously, at that time, because he would know that he would be surveilled, so he would take all precautions not to speak directly over phone. But through Nadesan and Polidevan, who were the kind of the official representatives of the LTT in the Vanni, and through KP, who was based in Southeast Asia those days, and we were in contact with Prabhakaran, he rejected such an offer. And I have to say I regret it enormously, because that would have saved tens of thousands of innocent Tamil lives, and would also have saved the lives of the LTT cadres, probably even Prabhakaran himself, so that they could be in a position to work for the Tamil cause another day. This, of course, cannot be any sort of excuse for the way the Sri Lankan government were pursuing the war, with indiscriminate killing, indiscriminate bombing, no respect whatsoever for the laws of war. It cannot be used as an excuse for that. But still, Prabhakaran is also responsible for the absolute horrendous loss of life at the end of the war in Sri Lanka.
Mr. Solheim, you have mentioned Politirvan. What was your role in what is being called as the white flag incident? Did you have any direct conversation?
Well, what we know very well is that Polidevan called Norway on the 17th of May 2009. It's very easy to remember the date because it's a Norwegian National Day, so we were all celebrating during the day with our children, walking in the streets of Oslo, but keeping the phone open to Vanni. He called us and told him his and Nadesan's intention to surrender. We told him that unfortunately this is far too late for us to be able to organize this in the appropriate way. If it had come earlier, of course we would have been able to do it with the Red Cross or with the UN or with someone else. But this was at the very end. We told him, please hoist a big white flag, make clear your intentions in the battlefield. If you have some loudspeaker or something like that, please use that to make your intention clear. And then we will inform the Sri Lankan government, which we did. because we are also aware that Polidevan brought this message through Indian and other envoys and Tamils in Colombo at the time. So clearly this message was brought to the attention of the government. The morning after, we woke up to the news that both Nadezham and Polidevan was dead. And to me there is not the slightest doubt as to who killed them, because we do not know exactly what military group who did the execution of these people, but they were killed by the Sri Lankan army, and when they wanted to surrender, which is of course completely unacceptable.
Let's go back to your role as the peace negotiator in Sri Lanka. What was the main reason for your attempt to fail in your perspective?
If we take this in a 10 years perspective, I'm not shopping in on every detail. I think there were two main reasons. Number one was the lack of coordination in the Sinhala politics. I mean, the two main parties, the SLFP and the UNP, could never really join hands and formulate an offer to the Tamils. When the Prime Minister and the President was from different parties, they were fighting each other. So it was very, very hard when the Sinhala elite could not join hands and reach out to Tamils, finding a solution. On the other hand, Mr. Prabhakaran had the offer of a federal solution in Sri Lanka. He hesitated, he didn't directly reject it, but he could not really embrace federalism when it was on offer. At that time, if Prabhakaran had accepted federalism, nearly all Tamils would have accepted federalism, and I think also the majority of Sinhalese at the time would have done it.
Is federalism still possible in Sri Lanka?
Whether you want to use the word, that's a matter for Sri Lankans to decide, but clearly a solution where there is wide-ranging self-government for Tamils in the north and east of Sri Lanka is the only way out to a long-lasting solution in Sri Lanka. This is not really that difficult. It's difficult to reach it, but you can look to India, you can look to Canada, you can look to so many other places in the world where you have federal solutions, and they work very well.
Does the former Prime Minister of England, Tony Blair, have a role in Sri Lanka now?
I doubt that he has any major role. He did not have a major role at that time. He seems to me be more of maybe of an economic advisor, how to attract investment to Sri Lanka, and I wish him well in that role. I'm not aware that he has any major role in...
The reason for this question is because he has visited Sri Lanka twice in a short span and met with the President of Sri Lanka and the Tamil leaders, which has sparked speculations that he's trying to negotiate a solution between the two sides.
Well, that question must be answered by the government and the TNA, but I am not aware of any major role for Tony Blair. I think he's going there on holiday. It's a beautiful, nice place where he wants to bring his family to the beaches. But I think he is on the side of promoting investment and economic prosperity to Sri Lanka, and in the long run that will also help. It will not, prosperity is not resolving the ethnic issue in Sri Lanka, but it's always easier to find solutions if there is economic development.
If it's not Norway or England, who can mediate between the Tamils and the Sinhalese for peace in Sri Lanka?
The Tamil National Alliance have got an overwhelming mandate from the Sri Lankan Tamils. They won basically a knockout victory in the last election, so the Sri Lankan Tamils have we put the trust in you, Mr. Samandan, and the other TNA leaders. They will have to negotiate with the President, with the Prime Minister, to find this settlement. Whether some third party involvement is needed is to them to decide.
Who can play the role?
It may not even be needed, but because these guys know each other very, very well. Mr. Samalan knows the Prime Minister and the President from 20 years or more in politics. So whether they need a third party is for them to decide. If they need one, they will discuss and pick.
Let me come back to the book, Mark Salters. Is your book an official version of Norway's attempt at peace in Sri Lanka, or what Norway wants the world to know as to what they have attempted in Sri Lanka in order to bring peace?
No, not at all. It's an account of the Norwegian engagement in Sri Lanka, which is informed by a very close-up evidence provided by Norwegian actors like Erik Solheim. But I was always clear from the start that I wrote this as an independent critical journalist, and I've tried to do the book in that way. So you'll find, if you look at the book, there's as much criticism, where I feel it's merited, of Norway's efforts in Sri Lanka as there is hagiography, or telling everybody how wonderfully they performed. So no, I mean that, and back to your earlier question, I mean why I hope at least it will be of interest for Sri Lankan readers is because it does provide, I think, a kind of relatively objective account of Norway's engagement, sort of warts and all. As much about the failings, the weaknesses, as about the strengths. And I do that not out of any desire just to be sensational or, push it. It's because I think Norwegians, really can learn from some of the things that Norway perhaps could have done differently in Sri Lanka when it comes to facilitating peace processes in the future.
As the author of such a book, were you engaged in Sri Lankan ethnic conflict beforehand?
Well, no, I wasn't coming into as a newcomer. I visited Sri Lanka first in 2002 and was there very regularly, actually, between 2002 and 2005 with the organisation I worked with at that point. So I would say from that I developed, and I read quite a lot around it. So I had a kind of more than usually informed understanding of the context. That said, of course, there was plenty that was new, especially the bits pertaining to sort of pre-CFA. I mean, the Elam War 1, 2, 3, although the 80s and 90s. So there was stuff that I didn't know a lot about, and then there were things that I found out about in the course of the book that were complete surprises to me. And just to give you one very clear example of this, something that Eric and I have spoken much about, is the 2005, the allegation that in advance of the elections, presidential election in 2005, which Mahinda Rajapaksa won, that there was a deal between the LTT leadership and Rajapaksa with regard to the election, specifically to ensure that there was a Tamil boycott of the elections in the north and east. Now, after doing, I read about this a bit, but I really, my journalist kind of instinct latched onto this. I just thought, this is extraordinary. I read very, very widely. I talked to lots of people in Sri Lanka, outside, journalists, what have you, about it. And my conclusion is that the evidence, I think, overwhelmingly points to the fact that there was a deal involving large sums of money on the government side, probably around $20 million, that the government paid the LTT for fixing that boycott. And of course what the government got was electoral victory. The margin of Mahinda Rajapaksa's victory in the 2005 elections is almost exactly equivalent to the Tamil boycott in the north and east. Now, if we just think about the implications of that, for example, that if that hadn't happened, if Ranil Wickremesinghe had won the election, the peace process might have gone on, the war, all kinds of might have. But it's an example of where I did genuinely pick up something new, and something new that I mention regularly because I think it's one of those issues where everybody, but first of all supporters of the LTT, need to look very hard in the mirror and ask themselves what was it that led to that disastrous end of the war. And that event was one of the decisive contributions to that.
Eric Solheim just indicated that peace is still possible in Sri Lanka. Do you share that sentiment as well?
I think I would tend to agree with Eric there. I mean, I think where the international engagement may become relevant is, for example, if the current government follows through on some of the commitments they made in the Geneva resolution last year, with respect to, for example, a domestic court, but with international participation. Well, if that actually becomes real, which of course we all hope it will, then international participation becomes a very important factor. So I think those kind of things, like mechanisms that the government sets up, processes in order to deal with war-related issues, accountability, truth-telling, dealing with the past and so on, maybe that's where international engagement will be most relevant, not in a formal mediation perspective or facilitate, more providing advice, support, best practices, comparative experience from other situations that can help Sri Lanka to do it to the best of its abilities to ensure that the outcome is a truly peaceful solution to Sri Lanka's long-term conflict.
Does the diaspora Tamil community have a part to play in such an outcome?
Well, I would hope, I don't know how much people have discussed this, but I would hope that, for example, when it comes to discussing things like international participation in domestic mechanisms, that's as much potentially relevant for the Tamil diaspora as it is for Western, NGOs from Norway or wherever. It's already true that some Tamil diaspora organisations are in dialogue with government officials. So why not let's see that dialogue lead to a concrete involvement of Tamil organisations in the diaspora in specific mechanisms and processes that the government sets up. Mangala Samarim has said very clearly we want festivals with Tamils from the diaspora involved. I think Tamils should be taking every possible opportunity. Tamil organisations in the diaspora should be seizing on every possible opportunity to engage, to support, to get in there, to make sure that they are part of the solution.
If I may add to this, there is hardly on the entire planet any diaspora which is so successful as the Sri Lankan Tamils. You are incredibly successful wherever you go. Tamils are doctors, engineers, dentists, stockbrokers. They are successful in all walks of life and have a lot of offer to Sri Lanka. So if Tamils from Canada and other places can come back, invest, share their experience, because Northeast Sri Lanka, from after all these years of war, it's also a very destitute place, need a lot of support. And where can I get that support if not from the Tamil diaspora?
Let me bring you back to 2009. You mentioned that you were in close contact with the LTT leadership, including Prabhakaran. Who were you in contact with on the Sri Lankan government side? And more importantly, who, if anyone, gave you the assurance of a possible end to the war on the Sri Lankan government side?
The main assurance were from another place, because we knew that if we could make such an arrangement, the Americans, the Indians and the key international actors would come so hard down on the Sri Lankan government to bend their arms to accept this. In the spring of 2009, clearly the Sri Lankan government, what they wanted was an all-out military victory. They wanted to wipe out the LTT, full stop. But if Prabhakaran had been able to accept and organize them to the war, the Indians and Americans would have told the government in no uncertain terms, you have to accept this, and it would have been organized. Our main contact with the government at the time was Basil Rajapaksa, so from him we also knew that at the end this would have worked out if we could have pulled it off.
Nowadays, when talking about Sri Lanka, people are using the words genocide and war crimes. What's your stand on this?
To me, it's very clear that that war crimes were committed in Sri Lanka. You are not allowed, in accordance with any international law, to indiscriminate bomb areas with a dense civilian population, to target hospitals, and nor for sure are you allowed to kill, say, the 12-year-old son of Prabhakaran after he has been taken into custody by the army. To kill off a boy like that, it's an absolute, it's so horrible, absolutely unacceptable. So clearly war crimes were committed. How this should now be prosecuted, by what mechanism, what individuals should be targeted, that's another matter, because you need to, of course, establish who were in charge and who made the exact decisions. But from international community, there is no doubt that war crimes were committed. For sure, war crimes were also committed by the LTT leadership, and since the key leaders are dead, there is no way you can go after that.
Okay, well, what about genocide?
I don't think the word genocide is relevant, because in international view, that is when you try to wipe out an entire population, like you try to kill, like Hitler tried to kill all Jews, or some Hutus in Rwanda tried to kill all Tutsis, because there was no attempt to kill all Tamils in Sri Lanka. However, there was horrendous bloodshed, huge war crimes, and we should focus on those, because if you focus on the idea of a genocide, you will basically we won't get international support which is needed to resolve this issue.
Do you believe the war crimes will be brought to justice?
I'm in no doubt that at the end the main perpetrators of war crimes in Sri Lanka will be brought to justice. If you look to other parts of the world, I mean, in Balkans, the Serb leaders at the end were brought to court. In Chile today, I mean, even last year in the United States of America, persons who were responsible for the killing of the Chilean folk singer Victor Jara in 1973 in Chile. That was one of the most high-profile killings in Chile those days. The people who were brought to court now, that's more than 30 years, 40 years in fact, after it happened. So it may take time, but war crimes never go back, they won't go away. You will have the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, for sure the Tamil diaspora, who would want justice for this, and it will happen.
Would bring the war criminal to international justice will help Tamil in achieving their goals?
I think an international component in the Sri Lankan settlement of this will be helpful, particularly for the reason that there is very limited Tamil trust in the Sri Lankan institutions. Most Tamil feel that in the past, when a commission had been appointed, it's appointed and no one see any report or any outcome of that process. So to establish trust, it will be more easier for the present government to do that with an international component. But of course nothing would be better if it's a pure domestic mechanism which is accepted by everyone and trusted by everyone. That's the ideal solution. But since at the moment there is limited trust, some international involvement would be helpful.
Could I just briefly, if I could add on that point, I think in addition to what Eric says, the additional reason why an international component would be very important for any domestic Sri Lankan mechanism is because, you know, domestic courts, judicial processes are simply not set up to deal with mass crimes. You know, crimes are individual, the whole legal process assumes a set of circumstances that simply don't obtain in war. You know, internationally there are judges, there are people in this field with experience of prosecutions in this context. So those are the people you need to help you out, and that's the reason that you need them to help you out, because it's not easy stuff to deal with in a legal context.
What is your opinion of the Northern Chief Minister Vigneshwaran's new organization?
I will not involve in the domestic Tamil politics in Sri Lanka, just to say that Tamil unity is to me a key objective, because the more Tamils stand united, the stronger force it will be in resolving the ethnic issue in Sri Lanka. If the Tamils are divided into many groups, it will be more difficult. So if the Chief Minister of the Northern Province can work very closely with the TNA leadership, that will strengthen the cause.
We cannot conclude a conversation about Sri Lanka without talking about India. What part did our neighbors to the north play in your peace attempt, and what part do you feel that they can still play going forward for Sri Lanka?
My view is that India played a very helpful role during the peace process, and from the Norwegian point of view, we took the view from day one that India is number one. You cannot replace India with China or the US or Europe, anything like that. I mean, just take a look at the map. In peaceful times, you could take your boyfriend from the Jaffna Peninsula or your girlfriend, bring them to India, go for cinema, and come back in the same night. I mean, the destiny of Sri Lanka is with India, not with China, not with the US, nor with anyone else. And throughout the peace process, India was helpful. They wanted arm's length distance to the peace process, mainly from the Indian perspective, very brutal experience of the war in the 1980s, where the Indian peacekeeping force, as you know, came into conflict with the LTT, and more than 1,000 Indians were killed. I mean, the Indians also were brutal at the time, but that was a huge kind of sore in the Indian psyche. So India did not want to be directly involved, but they supported Norwegian peace efforts 100% all through, with a number of great Indians being involved. If you look to the future, again, every Sri Lankan, Tamil and Sinhalese should understand your future are with India. China can be helpful, US can be helpful, Europe, everyone else can be helpful. but the destiny of Sri Lanka is India. The culture, religion, language, everything is so much linked to India. Also, of course, economic prosperity of Sri Lanka can only come with a close relationship to India.
Mark Salters, how has the response been for your book?
Well, I mean, the most intense response so far has been indeed from the Tamil diaspora, both here and in Europe. I mean, Tamils have been the people who turn up in numbers to the meetings, who ask the questions and who interview me, I mean, media-wise. So I think that probably tells you something about it. That said, we've had some very good feedback both in London and also in Oslo from others from outside. Of course, people who are handicapped by not having read the book yet, so I'm sort of expecting that it's going to take some time for people to feed back. But in a way, almost the response I'm both most eager to see but also most anxious about is in Colombo. Because who knows what people will think there. But we have that ahead of us. Anyway.
Thank you, Mark Salters. Thank you, Eric Solheim. I guess this conversation can be continued after reading the book. Thank you for sitting down with us, for Tamilini listeners and for Kaatuvali on a tight schedule, and hope to speak to you soon.